We're going to talk about distortion a little bit today. So we've talked about time-based effects, we talked about reverb, and we talked about delay, different types of delay. Last semester, we spent a lot of time working with delay as well. The reason for that is part of what makes this different than notation software is that notation is like a recipe for a great dish. It may look good, it may be accurate, but you actually have to make the dish, and the dish is the final product. The notation is just a roadmap to try to get other people, or yourself if you're the performer, to create the piece of music. What we're doing inside the computer is we're making the final dish. What I try to emphasize to my students is that you're creating a story inside the computer, right? The computer is an instrument that you're learning how to play, and you're creating content that you control the various elements of. What we've seen over the first few classes is how time-based effects, which is delay / echo or reverb, can enhance a very plain sounding recording. Most notably, we listened last week especially to how a snare drum and a timpani sounded close mic'd versus inside of a big room. And how a large part of a sound that we're used to hearing is the room that it's being played in. And that's very particular with drum instruments. And we've also learned that using delay properly can add music to what you've already written. It could create harmonies. It could create counterpoint. It can create cross rhythms. It can create ambience. It can do all sorts of stuff. When you combine them together, you can get really interesting sounds. They can add emotion to what you're listening to, right? They can just draw the listener in. Distortion is interesting because we are focused on, we have to teach everybody the pristine, best way to record something. So when you take Audio MIDI 2, we spent a lot of time with microphone placement and not overloading the preamps and not overloading Pro Tools when you're recording live instruments. That's great. But as we saw with the Telray delay, the circuit of that delay pedal, or whatever you want to call it, the delay unit, is driven. It adds a kind of saturation and dirt to the sound that changes the character of the sound, and then when you combine that with the time-based effects, you're really learning how to shape the sound. You're almost learning like the basic principles of mixing on sort of like on a micro level. Like you're working on that sound, and you just don't have a sound playing a part, but you are adding additional content, additional harmonic content, additional temporal content to that sound that you are, as the artist, working inside of Pro Tools or working inside of Logic or working inside of whatever DAW that you choose, you as the artist are making the decisions about how much of that effect should be heard versus the original unaffected sound. Distortion is used in mixing and in recording, and has been used in mixing and recording for quite some time. And we're going to look at the history of that. But first, let's just talk a little bit about what is distortion in music, when and how to use it. Distortion can be a powerful tool for engineers. In the right hand, distortion could add all sorts of flair to a track, fill out thinly recorded signals, and help mix a sound loud without reading loud on the meters. But unintended distortion can absolutely ruin a track. So what is audio distortion? Distortion refers to the altering or deformation of an audio signal's original waveform. Technically, any kind of audio processing, whether it's EQ, compression, time-based effects, alters an audio signal. But in audio production, the term is used to describe either intentional or undesired sonic destruction. Distortion is intentional. It's used as a creative effect. Think of audio distortion effects applied to vocals, guitars, drums, and other instruments. Some audio engineers also like adding subtle distortion into an audio signal with plugins to emulate the warmth and pleasant harmonics of analog gear. Distortion, however, can also be an unwanted result of overmodulating a signal past its clipping point. In other words, a signal distorts whenever it exceeds the maximum level that an audio system can handle. This is known as clipping distortion, and you can avoid it with proper gain staging. Now, we've gone over gain staging in some of the earlier classes. I will go over it again for the newbies. So here are a few kinds of distortion. Harmonic distortion refers to what happens when a processor, analog or digital, adds to or enhances the overtones of the original signal. As a reminder, overtones are multiples of the base frequency or fundamental. So if the fundamental is 100 hertz, overtones would occur at 200, 300, 400, etc. As the overtones increase in volume, or as more overtones are introduced, they rub and resonate against the original signal. It can appear subtle and warm, or it can become overblown and edgy. Either way you cut it, you're working with harmonic distortion. Transformers and tubes are the kinds of analog components which, when pushed hard enough, add these kinds of harmonics. Tape saturation, in which you drive a real or virtual tape machine, also adds harmonic distortion. Harmonic distortion can fill out or bolster a weak frequency range without tilting the apparent tonal balance too much. You have to be careful because pushing hard into harmonic distortion can color a sound more than you want to. You really have to work to get that sort of sense of how much is enough and how much is too much. So clipping distortion refers to overloading of a processor, pushing it beyond its maximum capacity or operating level, and creates a type of harmonic distortion. In the analog world, this results from driving a piece of gear beyond its recommended capabilities. Digitally speaking, clipping distortion occurs when pushing a signal above 0 dB FS, the digital ceiling, in a fixed point system. So we're using 24-bit right now, all right, in our classes. But Pro Tools is capable of doing 32-bit floating point. It's almost impossible to distort a floating point system. But fixed point system, that's when you're up in the red all the time on the meter, right? You can make clipping distortion, which doesn't sound good. And we want to sort of avoid digital clipping distortion. Let's leave these right here, right? Because these aren't stuff. Oh, bit crushing. That's another one we should talk about. So bit crushing is a great sound for the right situation. So we're working in 24-bit, right? And there's a plugin in Pro Tools where you can change something and make it 16-bit, 12-bit, 8-bit, etc. And you'll hear, we'll go over how that changes the sound. So we've got harmonic distortion, good when used correctly. Clipping distortion can be good, but digital clipping distortion, probably not so good. And then we've got bit crushing, right? So those are three kinds of distortions. Let's take a listen to how things worked out in history. So the very first known usage of distortion is on a song Rocket 88 by Jackie Branston. Jackie Branston was a band led by Ike Turner, of Ike and Tina Turner, Tina Turner's first husband. They had a lot of hits in the 1970s, 60s, R&B, and some crossover hits, most notably their version of Proud Mary by Creedence. They did like a really great version that was a huge, huge hit. And then there's all sorts of issues with Ike and his treatment of Tina, which you can go read about if you'd like. And she went out on her own, and she was sort of forgotten about. And in the 1980s, she had a comeback hit with Private Dancer and a couple of other songs. And she had a great career from that point on until she passed away. So this is 1951, and this is a #1 R&B hit. And a lot of people think of this as the first rock and roll song. Those of you that have taken Audio MIDI 1, I've talked about this song in that class when we talk about rhythm sections and how the bass line changes from quarter notes to eighth notes and then to shuffle eighth notes and all that. So we'll get into this for those of you that haven't heard this. What happened here is that his band recorded the song. The sax player sang it, and the legend is that when they were driving on Highway 61 between Mississippi and Memphis, where they were going to record the song at Sun Studios, which is Sam Phillips Studios, the amplifier fell out of the trunk of the car and the speaker got messed up. Like the paper on the speaker probably got cut up and everything like that. And the guitar player heard it and didn't like the sound. He was very depressed. But then in the control room, they were saying, hey, this is great. Just play with it. So you'll hear the guitar player is doubling the bass line on this tune. So we'll listen to this.
You women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my Rocket 88. Baby, we'll ride in style, moving all along. Is smart and designed, black convertible top, and the gals don't mind. Sporting with me, riding all around town for joy. Blow your horn, Raymond, blow.
So that's distorted guitar and the guitar player, which is typical of the style, doubling the bass line. You can hear that a lot on Chess Records, some of the blues tunes out of Chess Records in Chicago, that like Muddy Waters and Little Walter, even Chuck Berry, a lot of the bass lines are being doubled by the guitar. So that's harmonic distortion. So you're adding additional harmonics to the sound, right? And it's fattening it up. 1965, Keith Richards' guitar is transformed by a Maestro fuzz tone pedal, which looks like this here. So this Gibson's Maestro FZ1 fuzz tone was the first widely marketed fuzz distortion guitar and bass effect. Introduced in 1962, it achieved widespread popularity in 1965 after Keith Richards' prominent use of that pedal on the song Satisfaction. So when you hear bum, bum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, bum, that sound was so unbelievably influential in 1965. It sounds quaint now, but it was very radical back then. So let's take a refresh your memory with this. You know, I wasn't alive for Rocket 88. That's a little before my time, but I was alive when this came out, and it was on the radio 24/7 for, like a couple of months. Yeah, on AM radio. WABC 77 on your dial. So, Cream, Eric Clapton, Sunshine of Your Love. So Keith Richards used a pedal to alter the sound. Eric Clapton used volume to alter the sound of his instrument. What do I mean by that? So there's an album called the Beano album. So right here, right, it's the blues. John Mayall, like, this is like a little bit off topic, but London, mid 1960s. You had sort of like a university where there was the Graham Bond organization and John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, where young, hot musicians would be employed by these two band leaders. And then after a while, they would leave to go forward into like the Yardbirds and and other things. Eric Clapton was in the Blues Breakers, and they recorded this album, the Blues Breakers, John Mayall with Eric Clapton, and it's called the Beano album because he's reading this comic book here, which is called Beano. So it's called the Beano album. At that time, a guy named Jim Marshall had a music shop somewhere in London, and he got a hold of a Fender Bassman amp, and he took it apart and recreated the circuit, and then increased some of the gain that you could get, and just altered the circuit a little bit, and he started putting out his own albums, his own amplifiers. Eric loved the sound of these Marshall amplifiers, but when he was playing with John Mayall, there were no roadies. They were like a bar band working. When you look at you could see lists of gigs. They're doing like 5-6 gigs a week, all up and down. Like they go from England, they go over to Yorkshire, then they go over to Brighton and down to Brighton, and then they'll head over, just all these different places in England, and they'll play like a club one night, and they'll play like 2 nights over the weekend, and they were like a working band, right? So he had to do a lot of his own roadieing and driving to gigs. So he asked, Jim Marshall if he could create an amp that would fit, quote unquote, in the boot of his car, which means in the trunk of his car. So he came up with a combo amp with two 12-inch speakers, and I think it was like a 100-watt tube amp. And that was Clapton's amp of choice. And then when they went into Decca Studios to record an album, Eric had that amp turned up to 10 with just like incredibly loud. And he was playing a 1960 Les Paul, and they were playing live in the studio. And that's power tube distortion that he was getting out of his amp, because he had the preamp turned up enough and to drive the power tubes, and the power tubes were turned up so much that they were overloading the circuit. And he got a guitar tone that is still a lot of guitar players try to emulate today. That was just with this one amp. And what was great about that recording session was that they were all in a room together. And even though they tried to isolate Clapton's amp, it was so loud that every other microphone was in the room was picking up the amp, the sound of the amp, and it made the sound just sort of jump out of the speakers. Maybe we'll listen to a track from that. But so anyway, when he was with So the Graham Bond organization had Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, drummer and bass player, and they left. And then Clapton left the Blues Breakers, and those three got together and formed the Cream. And the Cream was like the first super group, quote unquote. And they had a huge hit with Sunshine of Your Love, both America and in England. And actually, Sunshine of Your Love was recorded in New York City. Atlantic Records, which is what they were signed to, they had a studio on 55th Street, I believe, between Broadway and 8th Avenue. It's just like a big, not a brownstone, but it's just a big townhouse kind of building with like every floor is a different business. The Atlantic Records had a floor there, and that's where like Giant Steps was recorded. Ray Charles was recorded there. Aretha was recorded there. Lots of records were recorded there. Then as they started getting more successful, they moved over to a sort of a triangular shaped building at the northwest corner of Columbus Circle. That building got torn down and they had Atlantic Records up there, and Led Zeppelin recorded there, Eric recorded there, or even more, Aretha was recorded there. Anyway, that building got torn down and replaced by something else, and this is where they recorded this. But what Clapton did for the Cream, they were playing in huge stadiums like Madison Square Garden. So they were, one of the first groups to start playing in these big stadiums, and the PA technology of the time was not what it is today. Like when I went to see Toto, they only had Steve Lukather's guitar amps on stage. Everything else was plugged into the PA. And you're getting the sound mostly from the PA, not from the stage. And you can go to see many bands nowadays where the guitar players in younger bands are using modelers instead of real amps. The stage is almost silent, and they're listening on in-ear monitors, and the front of house engineer is controlling all of the sound through the PA. Well, the PA technology was not like that back then, right? This was like, having bear skins and stone knives back then. And so to get the volume, he used these two 100-watt Marshall amplifiers, and he would have his signal plugged into both of these. And each one of these speakers cabinets, and there's 4 here, had 4 12-inch speakers in it. So he had 8 16 speakers, and what he would do to get more distortion out of the sound is he'd take a razor blade and slit the speakers. So here, let's take a listen to this, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
It's getting near dawn, when lights close the tired eyes. I'll soon be with you, my love, give you my dawn surprise. I'll be with you, darling, soon. I'll be with you when the stars start falling.
Then, of course, we've got Jimi Hendrix, not the cigarette on the headstock. Yeah, no, he was the person that actually started that, the cigarette on the headstock. That was one of his great contributions to guitar playing. Okay, so Jimi Hendrix used this pedal by Jim Dunlop, or the Dallas Arbiter fuzz face pedal, would use germanium transistors. So there's silicon and germanium, right? The early pedals used germanium, and then they graduated to silicon because they were more stable. The germanium they're not as durable. They're more temperamental, depending upon temperature and the kind of signal that goes in, but they had a kind of sound, right? So Jimi Hendrix used the fuzz pedal to add harmonic distortion to his tone, and this is what this sounded like. 1966, when this stuff came out, it was mind-blowing to a lot of people. There's a really famous photograph of one of Jimi Hendrix's first gigs. Jimi Hendrix was an American. He was born in Seattle, and then he was in the military. He was a paratrooper. And I think that he broke his leg, and so he was released from the military. But he played guitar all the time, and he got a lot of experience playing what was called the Chitlin circuit, playing R&B with like all these, not James Brown, but James Brown type acts all over the South, right? And so he learned a lot about showmanship there. And then what happened was that he was playing in New York City at a place called the Cafe Wa, W-H-A, a question mark, down in Greenwich Village. And a guy named Chaz Chandler, who was, I believe, the bass player with this band, English band called The Animals, and their big hit in the 60s was House of the Rising Sun. They had a couple of other songs. He decided at that point that he wanted to become a record producer and a manager, so he brought Jimi Hendrix to England and helped him with his first album. And one of the first gigs that Jimmy did was he played at a club somewhere, and when you look in the audience, you can see Mick Jagger, Pete Townsend from The Who, Paul McCartney from the Beatles, all like standing, because they were all friends, all standing around each other. And, it's like, think about like, all the biggest guys going to hear this new phenom, right? And just what he played with his trio was, for them, mind-blowing, because they'd never heard anything like that before. In 2024 ears, we've heard this so many times, but you have to sort of always take things in the context with which they were produced, right? And this is 1966. So now the Beatles, never one to let a good thing go. with their song Revolution in 1968. What they did was they directly injected into one channel of the red console. So this is the recording console in the studios that they worked in. And these were tube-based consoles, right? So they had power tubes inside of them. They took the guitar, they put it into a DI box, and a direct injection box, and then they plugged it into one channel of the mixing console. They turned it all the way up so it was distorting, and then Lennon didn't think it was enough, so they took the output of that and put it into a second channel and did the same thing. And then you ended up with this sound here.
You say you want a revolution, well, you know.
In the 80s, let's listen to this, the guitars on this. Peter Gabriel.
To show identification, I got no paper show you what I am. You'll have to take me just the way that you find me. What's gone is gone and I do not give a damn.
All right, so that's some examples historically of tracks that use a lot of distortion and some of the first tracks. So Sean wants to know if they distort piano. I think this is on, it's on the second Return to Forever album. Not super distorted, but definitely overdriven. Let's go to the end of this. I mean, that piano is pretty fat right there. It's pretty overdriven. Ray Charles, his Wurlitzer. This is kind of overdriven. I mean, you hear how nasty that is? And this Wurlitzer had a tube and preamp, and he's just pounding on it. So yes, pianos get distorted, vocals get distorted, basses get distorted,